Okay, so here we are. Welcome, everyone. We are in a high-level diplomacy club briefing, which is much more intimate than our usual Monday call. So we thank all of you for being supporters and leaders in our network. We deeply believe in the transatlantic relationship and in the importance of the Israel-Europe relationship, and we're obviously aware of the challenges, but also try not to forget the opportunities that are very, very significant. We have an incredible speaker today who's also an alumni of some of the ELNET programs, Major Andrew Fox, who doesn't really need too much introduction. I'll just mention that he was senior in the British Army from 2005 to 2020 to 2021. He served in multiple fronts, including Afghanistan, of course, where he's probably best known. He's very active on social media and in the think tank world. And of course, Andrew, you're a great friend to our community. So with your permission, Major, I'll call you by your first name.
Cool.
And let's begin. A lot of people are still joining, so give it another minute. A lot of pings here on the Zoom. But again, thank you everyone for joining. And this is a very critical time. We're around 100 days before the Israeli elections, which are now scheduled for October 27th. Of course, that's right before the midterms in the United States. There are going to be multiple elections in Europe next year, and the UK just went through another change of Labour government. So I'm sure, Major, you'll discuss that with us in a moment. But maybe let's begin with what is most on everyone's mind. It's the ongoing, call it war, between the United States and Iran over the Strait of Hormuz, the regional balance in the Middle East, of course, the nuclear program and many aspects of it that we'd love to hear your perspective on where we are, why we are where we are, what is missing, what was wrong with the strategy, who has the upper hand, who has the lower hand, and where we go next. So please, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And it's always a real pleasure to speak to ELNET. I've been on trips to Israel, had access that I would have never have gained without ELNET's assistance. And they've been, especially as someone who left the army and was moving into a new career, they were absolutely instrumental in helping me get on my feet and get to where I am today. So I'm always incredibly grateful and always incredibly pleased to have the chance to speak with ELNET. So the Iran piece, I think, it's a real study in what we call ends, ways, and means from a military perspective. And that's really kind of staff officer talk for saying strategy, operational design, and then tactics. And I'll give you a quick talk through of how those concepts interact in the military mind, because I think it's a useful lens to look at what's happening on the ground in Iran at the moment. So it starts with the political. It always starts with the political. You don't just drop bombs. You don't just send troops. You don't just send ships. You're trying to achieve a political end. And that goes right back to Clausewitz, who wrote in the early 1800s, when he said war is politics with the admixture of other means. So you always have to have a political goal. From that, you derive a strategic military aim. So you've got political strategy, and then you have military strategy. And the military strategy talks about the ends, the end results that you want. What are you working towards to contribute towards the political end state? Because, of course, the political end state will not just be military. It'll include diplomacy. It'll include economics. Those are the three traditional levers of government: military, political, economic. And I think in 2026, I would add information to that as well. I think we're seeing such a powerful use of information by a variety of actors that actually it's becoming a lever in and of itself of government power. So you've got these levers. You work out as a military commander where your contribution to that broader strategy is, and then you sequence your tactical actions to achieve that strategic goal. Now, what you have to be able to have is a strategic goal that you have the means to achieve. So you could say, right, we want to shoot down the Death Star, but if you don't have any X-wings and you don't have any any torpedoes to fire, then you can't do it. So you have to have the kit that you need to achieve the goal that you want. And that's what we would call your strategic limitations. So when you're setting your strategic goal, you have to make sure you have the resources, the troops, the planes, the ships, the bombs, most importantly of all, the petrol to keep your stuff going, the gas. All of these things contribute towards you formulating your strategy, your operational design, and the tactics you use to get there. And I think what we're seeing in the Middle East right now is, first of all, we've seen varying political goals on the part of the US Israeli coalition. And that makes the military job really, really difficult. And we found that in Afghanistan as well. That was absolutely the story of my war, because on the ground in Afghanistan, we were frequently doing counter narcotics, we were doing counter Taliban leadership, we were ground holding, and then the people were the center of gravity. This was changing all the time. So it's really, really hard for a military to set their goals and their means and their ends when the politicians keep changing their mind. And I think at the start of this Iran war, it wasn't explicitly stated, but I think it was very, very clear that there was a regime change angle to it that was very rapidly abandoned. We then switched to getting rid of the nukes, which in and of itself is an incredibly challenging job, because you can blow up all their facilities, you can blow up all their scientists, you can remove all their uranium. But if they've still got the intent to do that, how do you then stop the regime starting again in secret once you've stopped bombing them? Okay, so to say you want decisively to ensure that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon, it's a really hard goal to achieve militarily. It requires an awful lot of other levers to come into play that, frankly, we just haven't seen yet. You can degrade their army and air force and navy, great, but how do you stop them rebuilding it? You can say that you want to free up the Strait of Hormuz, which is all very well, but how do you maintain its freedom? How do you persuade an industry that works on insurance? How do you persuade those insurance brokers to set insurance costs to travel through the Strait of Hormuz that are affordable for companies running oil tankers? And again, you can see that immediately sits outside the military space. And so bombing stuff is just one small part of what should be a much, much bigger picture. And my biggest concern of what we're seeing in Iran at the moment is that actually bombing stuff is the end state. Now, I'm not seeing any signs that suggest that we're looking at regime change. I'm not seeing any signs that insurance companies are looking any more comfortable about the state of the Strait of Hormuz. And then I think if we look well, I spoke earlier about logistics and all the bits you need to keep your war going. I think that's a really, really important thing to look at, because it will hugely be factoring into the Iranian side of the house. Because if you think about it, every time they fire a drone, something has to intercept that drone. Now, it could be a fighter jet in the air shooting it down. It could be an attack helicopter. It could be a CRAM. You might have seen the videos of that, the bursts of sort of machine gun fire that sort of sparkle into the night. It's quite a cool looking bit of kit. It might be a CRAM, or it might be a Patriot if it's a ballistic missile you're trying to intercept, or a THAAD, or one of the many, many other missile defenses that are out there. Now, of course, drones are cheap. Interceptors are genuinely quite expensive. So that puts a sort of an economic clock on the war. And if we look at the expenditure of global stocks, CSIS did an estimate where they reckon about 50% of the world's interceptor stocks were fired by our side during the first round of fighting. And it will take between 40 and 50 months to replenish those stocks. That's quite an astonishing figure if you think about it. It works up to between 15 and $20 billion worth of equipment just spent defending against Iran's counterattacks with their hugely reduced missile stocks. So there's a real pressure on the Gulf states. And I think that's why we're seeing Iran hitting them rather than Israel. Israel's got Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow 3. It's got THAAD, it's got Patriot. It's got probably the best missile defenses in the world for very, very good reason. They've had a huge amount of need for them, particularly over the last 2.5 years, but even beforehand. So that's why I think why we're not seeing Israel being struck, because the Iranians know it's actually far more bang for their buck to chuck it at the Gulf states, to chuck it at Jordan. They understand that the Jordanians perhaps weren't as ready as the Gulf states were, and so we've seen impacts. And it doesn't really matter how many you fire if you're Iran. That's the really strange thing for them, is because it's cheap. These are not expensive missiles. They're not expensive to make. They're not expensive to fire. And their strategic effect goes far, far beyond the cost of firing them. So even if only one in every 10 gets through, that one is good enough. And actually, just as a side note, when you're planning for missile defenses, it's 1 in 10 impact is what you actually plan off. So if it's a 90% success rate for your defenses, they're absolutely performing as expected. No defenses are 100%. So for the Iranians, that 1 in 10 is enough. And they will be winding that clock of missile interceptors as hard as they can, combined with the other big clock, of course, that's running, and that is the global economic clock. We're already seeing global strategic oil reserves down at levels that we hadn't seen since the mid 1980s in the tanker crisis. And of course, that is going to create a global inflationary shock. And it probably already will. The scale of the shock is going to depend on how long the Strait of Hormuz is closed for. And there might be a counter argument that America is slightly better protected against this than the rest of the world because America has oil independence, which is true. But unfortunately, these prices are globally set. It's a global oil price. So that is going to hit Americans at the gas pump, at the supermarket. And of course, there is a midterm election coming up, which the Iranians will equally be fully aware of. And I think the final clock that the Iranians will be looking at is the American presidential clock, because it's only another 2 years until the next president takes over. If Mr. Trump loses the midterms, he may well be a far lamer duck than he would like to admit. And that is basically time for Iran. And so they will be looking at this from that perspective. So where does it go? I mean, that's the biggest challenge. I think it ends in one of two ways. If you want a good outcome, you're going to have regime change. But is there a military way to achieve that? I'm a bit more skeptical than some, especially given the two clocks I mentioned in terms of missile defenses and the global economy. I'm not sure there is time or means to achieve regime change, which really leaves only one other option, and that is to come to some sort of a deal with the regime in Tehran, which is going to be very distasteful, politically difficult to sell as a victory. No really good options on the table here. And it really, I think it's going to depend on when Mr. Trump sees his points of pain as to which option he decides to take. But I don't have a crystal ball, and I'd hate to predict what Donald Trump's going to do because he is, if nothing, an agent of chaos. So I think I'll stop there, David, if that's a sort of top level summary, and we can drill into anything you'd like to.
That was pretty exhaustive. Thank you. But I guess two questions on that. The first is there's also a middle ground, between more of the same regime change or capitulation and some sort of weak deal. It's also some sort of ground operation that would secure the Strait of Hormuz, the coastline. There's a lot of speculation about President Trump either, hesitating about that, but that's certainly an option that's on the table as a mid option. How do you see that tactically, strategically playing out?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly an option. Where does it get us to though? Is a strategic goal. I mean, if opening the Strait of Hormuz is your political goal, then yeah, I guess you need to start doing something different because it's not working right now. Um, it is probably worth pointing out that the Strait of Hormuz was open before this war. So if
Of
that's your
course.
political goal, then you've had a horrible, horrible setback. That's a very, very hard sell if you say that the only outcome now is getting Hormuz open. That's really, really difficult to I think spin in any positive way whatsoever. But look, if you put troops on the ground, you're going to have a lot of American deaths, and I think that's the
Correct.
bottom line here. We're seeing, I think is it 14 or 16 killed in action already, and over 300 injured, and that's in a very, very standoff tactical laydown. In other countries around the region, not even on the ground in Iran. Um, I think it's exceptionally challenging as a military operation because if you look at the length of that coastline, it's huge. It's not just the Strait of Hormuz, it's the entire coastline that runs all the way up to the north. To secure every inch of that waterway, to me, it looks like there aren't enough troops in the US military to achieve that. So if you focus them on Hormuz, fair enough. But it's still going to need a huge wraparound of an enormous military operation. Um, Very, very difficult, very, very challenging. Not impossible. Um, if it's done right, it won't cost hundreds of lives, but I think it would cost some lives. and whether the appetite is there to sell those flag-draped coffins to the American people, I'm not entirely sure. So it's not it's not a gimme, but it's doable, but it's gonna hurt.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And this is now also a moment to remind everyone that we're in a small, this is on the record, but it's an intimate conversation with a excellent observer of international relations and where we are. So everyone that is on the Zoom is invited to present questions in around 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes or so. We'll turn to you. So anything that you really are thinking about or wondering about or concerned about, this is an opportunity to discuss this with Major Fox. One thing that you didn't mention is Europe and the transatlantic relationship. And this is really interesting because if you think about some sort of mediated outcome of this war, who are your mediators right now? It's Pakistan, it's Qatar, it's not really international geopolitical heavyweights with the leverage to really force a deal or bring the Iranians to the table under better terms. What's missing here is the E3. It's Germany, UK, France. In the past, this was the envelope. This was the other side of the American military power was the international diplomatic force that is just not there today, unfortunately. And you could argue, of course, that Trump had his share of misdemeanors here in this relationship from Greenland on down the list. But also there's a certain responsibility on European leaders as well. You could say that they're being a little defeating by not really attempting to come into this relationship from their side and bring the E3, power to the table. And I'm not just talking about right now. I mean, it's the 2 years. It's even further back into Trump's first term. It's during Biden. Were they bipartisan enough? Did they reach out to back channels on both sides? I mean, where do you see the transatlantic relationship now? And what could it have done if everyone was working on this together?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's grievances clearly on both sides. I'm not going to relitigate those particularly. I think it's been said and done many times before, not least by me. But look, the key thing here is, I think, when it comes to this war and European involvement, is the Israel factor. And I think we have to acknowledge that the information storm against Israel over the last 2.5+ years has been incredibly effective in what it's done. And that was Iranian design. And I think we have to not pretend that there isn't, an evil hand behind this, because there absolutely is. It was part of their design to isolate the Israelis, and it's really worked. And this is, I think when we see this complete hands-off approach from Europe over Iran, I think it's because it's an Israel-involved war. And if we went to war alongside or tangential even to Israel, you would see protests on European streets like never before. We had 1 million people protest the Iraq war. I think if we engaged in this war in any kind of military way, you would see even bigger protests because of the Israeli perspective. And then, of course, we can factor in the demographic changes that have happened in Europe since 2003 and so on and so forth. There's a lot of other parts at play here. Not least the huge unpopularity of Donald Trump. And a poll came out just last week where 1 in 10 Europeans now see America as an ally. 1 in 12 see America as an active opponent. And you can, like I said right at the top, you can dig into the autopsy of that in whichever way you like, but it's just the fact now that this is a record low in terms of transatlantic relations. So that's unfortunately where we are, and we're starting to see, I think, the enormous downside of ignoring the soft power aspect of that relationship, that Europe isn't playing the role that perhaps it would have done in the past.
Yeah, I think for our donors and supporters, it's always important to understand that Europe has a very important role to play in the world today, and certainly in terms of Israel's security and safety, not just in terms of the Arrow 3 or a missile defense system or another defense cooperation program or a technology program, but actually the importance of Europe in the international stage if it chose to play that role. And that's something that I think we should certainly all think about how to improve in the future. We're 100 days before elections in Israel. Andrew, how do you see the prospects of a different Israeli government dealing with the same set of cards, but looking at things a bit differently? Whether it's and it's an opportunity to talk about Syria for a minute, Lebanon, of course, Hezbollah, what's happening there with the Lebanese government and the negotiations in Washington, and the role of the international community, and maybe a few words about Gaza. All these open fronts that are still out there. What do you see the prospects of European-Israeli cooperation with a new government in Israel, a new tone, more diplomacy, and so on?
So just a small remit for this answer then. Look, I think a reset would be hugely beneficial at this point. I think Netanyahu has got his advantages and his disadvantages. I think his coalition is a huge disadvantage in terms of the makeup of that coalition. And just this week we've seen Itamar Ben-Gvir parading towards Gaza with his fellow extremists, and look, that makes, frankly, all of our jobs a lot more difficult. It's almost as if that section of Bibi's coalition actively wants the world to hate Israel as much as humanly possible. A change of government, I think, would be refreshing, certainly from an ally of Israel perspective. It's not my place to comment on internal Israeli politics, and frankly, I'm not. It's not my sphere of expertise to do so. But certainly, in terms of an international reset, that would be helpful, I think, at this point. Um, when it comes to the broader fronts, and this is the topic of my book that's coming out early next year. It's called The Seven Front War. And it goes into the backgrounds of all of these seven fronts, and where these proxies came from and how they developed into being part of this Iranian network. And I drag it back, I think, in terms of answering this question, to my very first answer, where I spoke about strategy and the military ends having to be within your realistic gift to achieve. And that's really the problem Israel has faced. And I interviewed Yoav Gallant about this, the former Israeli defense minister, and his take was that on 7th of October, Israeli strategy was a dirt road. By the time the war in Iran this year launched, he said it was now a motorway, which I thought was a nice analogy to show how they've had to try and make this up on the go. They weren't expecting to have to fight this war today, or on 7th of October 2023. And they very much had to kind of build the plane as it flies when it comes to Israeli strategy. But there comes a hard limit, I think, on what Israel can achieve on her own. Like, Israel cannot remove Hezbollah. Israel alone cannot make the Lebanese armed forces capable and willing to take Hezbollah on. It can't change Shia disaffection with the Lebanese state. It can't change, these social factors that underpin Hezbollah's predominance in the south. They should sit in Beirut. And the fact that Beirut can't make that difference either means perhaps that nobody can at this point. So everything has to be in a holding pattern. And we see that in Syria as well. Al-Sharaa, everything looks kind of positive there right now. Yeah, there are huge negatives, and we all know Al-Sharaa's background, and we all know about the slaughter of the Druze and the massacres of the Alawites on the coast, and his approach to the Kurds in the northeast. None of it's ideal. I'm not making a case for even 1 second that it's perfect, but it's actually slightly better than we thought it would be. But it is uncertain, which is why Israel is holding that buffer zone in the south, right over the Vale of Tears, and you can go there, and it's exactly the same terrain that was seen in 1974. It's right there. So that's an uncertain area, and then of course in Gaza, it's kind of out of the IDF's hands at this point. America now owns this problem with the Trump Board of Peace. Like, that's not Jerusalem's problem anymore, really. Yes, they hold the security line, and yes, they're waiting for somebody else to find the ability to take over that security, etc., etc., and all of these problems. But it's really, again, just a holding pattern, because it's not within Israel's gift to finally fix that problem. And so we're seeing this pattern time and time again, that Israeli strategy is good, but it runs into this hard stop of the fact that factors outside of their control will decide how this stuff ends. So it's a matter of management rather than decisive decision making, which is an incredibly challenging strategic environment to operate in because you never know where the end of the demand on your own side is going to be, which means you have to manage reserve mobilization and the drain on society and the rehabilitation of soldiers who are wounded and injured, and so on and so forth. Keeping your ammunition supply stocked in the context of a world that hates you, where even young Americans are now firmly against Israel and American continue to support for Israel. So politically in Israel, there are a huge number of challenges. The military component is only a small part, and it doesn't have the ability to bring things to a decisive conclusion.
Right.
Andrew, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sia, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say we're starting to get a couple questions now.
Oh, good.
And let's start with our chair emeritus and co-founder, Larry Hochberg. He has a question for Andrew.
Perfect.
This is a little off the issue, but not too much. There's hits going on now to various Arab countries, including Jordan and UAE and whatever. Long term, are they confident enough, or do they need the U.S. enough to back us up in some of these offensive things, even if limited, that the Americans think they want to try to do? Or are they going to make it difficult for the Americans to have a solid front?
It's a really interesting question, and I think the golden rule with the Arab states is they will always play not only both sides, they will always play every side that they can. What they want is stability and balance. That's the key, the key kind of driver for everything they do. And the Iranians have been relatively clever in what they've targeted in, say, places like Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, and that is American military infrastructure. So they can quite credibly say, we're only shooting at the American stuff. Now, that's not true because they've been hitting water salination plants. They've been hitting civilian assets. We've seen airports hit. We've seen, even the Ras Laffan, even the Qataris have taken a slice of this from the Iranians. But it's just credible enough that the Iranians can say, oh, these things happen. The other factor is the Gulf states, I don't think really bring anything useful to the table when it comes to the offense, if you will. And a really good example of that is the fact that there is a Kuwaiti pilot who was only 2 off being an ace from having single-handedly shot down 3 American fighter jets at the start of the war. The interoperability of a multinational operation is actually hugely challenging. It works really well with us and the Americans because, well, us, the Brits, because we all speak the same language. That isn't the case when you've got many different languages in the sky, firing huge amounts of ammunition around the place. Things go frequently very badly wrong. They're not strong. They're not particularly useful militarily. And I'd point you to the Middle East Forum. They wrote a really interesting article called Why Arabs Can't Fight, which sounds a bit racist on the surface of it, but actually digs into the kind of psychology behind Arab combatants. And it's why they're very good at irregular stuff, but not great at regular stuff like we're seeing now. So I think the best thing the Arabs could do is maintain their support. They know Iran are awful. They don't like the Iranians. They don't like the Shia extremism. They don't like the destabilizing effect and the fact that their economies have been smashed over the last 3 or 4 months. So they will maintain that alliance, particularly the Jordanians, because actually, if we look at the 7 fronts that Iran created, the 8th front was meant to be Jordan. Their goal before launching anything was to overthrow the Hashemites, the rulers of Jordan, and they were going to do that through the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's why the Muslim Brotherhood is banned in Jordan now, because they were conducting subversive activities against the monarchy. So the Jordanians are particularly alive to the Iranian threat. So I think their allyship, I think, will be beyond question. Their participation is less than desirable, would be my take.
Okay.
Thank you, Larry. Sia, more questions?
Tom Shapiro sent me a message. Tom, do you have a question for?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. So, Andrew, what happens to the dynamics if the Abraham Accord moves forward and has a number of these Gulf states agree to it, how does that change the region, and if that, what does it do for Israel, and especially what does it do for the United States? And my follow-up question is, what about this report in the Wall Street Journal about Iran having nuclear capabilities again? How does that get addressed?
Yeah,
I guess that was two
Right.
questions.
yeah, of
Good
course.
question.
Of course. So, I mean, the Abraham Accords, look, I'm broadly skeptic on the Abraham Accords. I think the issue of Palestine is now too challenging. So I think the initial round of Abraham Accords under Trump 1, um, the for the broader Arab world, the biggest flaw was that it sidelined the issue of Palestine. It was normalization with Palestine out of the equation, and I think that was one of Sinwar's drivers to launch 7th of October when he did. Not the only one, not the most important one, but it was certainly a factor. I think the Arab world, their leadership always has a balancing act between what they say and do in public and keeping their populations happy, particularly in places like, say, Bahrain, where they have a Shia majority and a Sunni minority ruling them. That creates these inherent tensions. Saudi Arabia is known as the guardian of the two mosques. It's the closest the Muslim religion has to a Vatican, if you will. It would be a very politically bold move at this time to acknowledge Israel and formalize relations with them whilst the issue of Palestine is unresolved. And I think that is going to continue to be the stumbling block in terms of expansion of the Abraham Accords. When it comes to the nuclear file, I mean, look, this is incredibly difficult stuff. I think I spoke about Clausewitz earlier. Yeah, and I gave you the bit that everyone always quotes, but there's another quote from Clausewitz which says, "In war, even the simplest thing becomes difficult because of friction." And I think that's what we're seeing here. On paper, it looks like it should be sensible. You hit the regime, you strike the sites, you kill the scientists, you remove their uranium, and then the nuclear problem's gone. That looks really simple, I think, when you spell it out like that. But in military terms, that's actually incredibly difficult. And we've got sites like Pickaxe Mountain, which are so deep underground that you're unlikely to take it out from the sky. So what are you going to do? Are you going to put troops on the ground? If so, what troops are those going to be? Are they going to be a special forces team doing the raid from hell? Are you going to put in 2 divisions and try and seize and hold that chunk of terrain and then send your soldiers underground to fight in tunnels? This is really difficult, huge muscle moves when it comes to a military operation. All while the troops on the surface are getting pounded by drones, and yeah, it's a really difficult military mission. So it's all going to come back down, I think, to some of the other levers. I'd be really surprised if they went for the full regime change option. I mean, I'd love it. I think it would be utterly commendable, but I think it's militarily maybe too big a task, especially with Iraq and Afghanistan being so fresh in our memories too. So what do we do with the nuclear stuff? I think it's going to have to come down to a discussion, which is the last place we want to be. And I think perhaps quite a lot of this bombing that we're seeing now is a chance to shift the needle maybe on the negotiating position. Whether that will work or not while Hormuz remains closed, I don't know. But, I think the simple answer to your question is that this is just an exceptionally complicated mess. And it's going to be really hard to come away with a deal or a final solution or final conclusion that looks like a win. It's unfortunately, much as I'd like to see a win, much as I wanted more than anything a win, I think a win is now looking incredibly difficult to come by.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Good questions, and this is the heart of the issue, at least from Israel's perspective and security long term. It really is. It's always been about the nuclear program. I mean, obviously the proxies and the ballistic missiles, but as you said, Andrew, the Strait of Hormuz is a new issue. It wasn't a problem before the war, and Pickaxe Mountain again is impossible to do from the sky. It's hard granite rock, and part of the concern about this whole war has been that if you go after the other sites, it was pretty clear that they were going to move things into deeper and deeper sites like this one, and it's real. It's a big problem. You're seeing it all over the news. I think Trump today made another statement that they're going to take it out. So it's front and center. So,
And David, if I could just
yeah.
add one thing, just from personal experience, I went to visit the Israeli Air Force in January this year. Um, and there's a really interesting phenomenon with the IDF, and that's if the army won't tell you something, just go and ask their Air Force, and they'll tell you straight away. So I spoke with this colonel in the Air Force, and he was quite open with the fact that even with the massive ordnance penetrators that the B-2s dropped during the 12-day war, that Fordo was still operational after that. So that was new information to me, and I don't think it's really in the public domain either, but I'm happy to share it with you. So even Fordo wasn't taken out completely, and Pickaxe Mountain is way deeper than Fordo. So that gives you an idea of how challenging it is to completely destroy something underground from the sky. And the IDF could have told the Americans that from their experience in Gaza. It's actually, you have to drop a lot of munition, even in the sand of Gaza, never mind the solid rock of Iran or southern Lebanon. So, that just gives you an idea of the scale of the problem.
And the heavy ammunition that the United States has left after the war last year is not much. What is it? 6 heavy bombs left to be used out of the 30, and I think 24 were used. So these are very difficult issues, and it goes back to, at some point, the E3 and the United States have to figure out their game plan, because, if it does come down to diplomatic leverage, sanctions, economic power, other tools, coercive tools, we're going to have to think this through. So it leads me to the next question, Andrew. From your experience, both with a network like ours, ELNET, you've been on the ground with us, just so that our supporters know, Andrew was a member, actually one of the leaders of a military delegation that was embedded in the IDF, ELNET delegation. You were there before and after us, in Gaza, through your own connections, but it was a significant moment. So when, our network is composed of 6 full-time regional offices on the ground operating in really, the main European centers of power today, and with all the complications, what would you recommend to a network like ours about how to move things forward, whether it's on the bilateral relationship, the Europe-Israel relationship writ large, again, taking into consideration that there's elections in 100 days, and there could or could not be a change politically in Israel, but maybe you could even lay out the 2 scenarios: a positive one, a negative one. Positive one being that there's a lot more flexibility and tailwind to do positive things. What would you recommend to a network like ours in terms of the priorities for, let's say, 2027?
That's a really interesting question. I think the great power of Israel is Israel itself. And that's a strange thing to say, but I mean, in terms of being in Israel, seeing Israel, learning about Israel firsthand, because that country is just surrounded in this insane information bubble right now. And it's jarring. You go on social media and you read people saying things about Israel and Israelis. And look, I've been there 15 times now. I know Israel pretty well. I know Israelis pretty well. And the jarring disconnect between what I know and what everyone in the world is saying, it's like you're disassociating at times. It's absolutely bizarre. And the power of bringing people to Israel, showing them the truth, I think is the single most powerful weapon that a network like ELNET has. And also, I think also kind of finding a way to make that not a one-off is a really difficult challenge as well. And I think that's where the geographical spread of ELNET really helps, because you can make vertical relations with Israel, but then you can maintain horizontal relations with the other countries in your network. And you can kind of keep the visit alive almost. Because actually, one thing that's been really powerful since I came, I've been on visits with groups like ELNET and BICOM and others, is just the WhatsApp group that you have afterwards with all the people that you went on the trip with, where you get opportunities to speak and you can share them around. And if you come up with new information, you can share that to people as well. And what you're really doing then is you're sort of ink blotting out from that one point of your visit of stepping foot in the Holy Land to the network of people you were there with, to an international network that is of like-minded people. I think that's really powerful. And I think that's how you maintain a sort of pro-Israel kind of footprint in these countries that are currently under siege from foreign information or disinformation, is by having that network of truth tellers who can all stay in contact, share stuff, go out and speak to others and spread the message more broadly. So as many visits as possible, but then the follow-on activity I think is really important as well to keep that momentum going and keep that ink blot spreading.
I love that answer, Andrew. Thank you. And just so that everyone knows, we've had, not going to believe this because I don't believe it, 79 delegations since October 7th. 79 delegations. Our latest is the point person on Horizon Europe, who's in Israel. He's a German legislator from the European Parliament. He is tasked, this is Eller, he's tasked with, negotiating the Horizon program for the next 7 years, starting next year. So it's 8 years from now. And it's a 200 billion euro scientific program, but it also has defense cooperation and technology elements to it, which is another 300 billion. So it's basically a half a trillion in the pot in Europe. And it's not all obviously for Israel, but the fact that he's in Israel is through his engagement with ELNET. And it's just an important moment for everyone to understand how significant this is. He went to the Weizmann Institute today, the Technion today. He's meeting with the country's leadership. He's trying to help Israel think through strategically how to manage this portfolio. Looking forward 8 years, who are the scientists? What are the programs? What are you putting on the table? How is that going to moderate your public relations? And he's really doing it on behalf of a friendly government, on behalf of Germany that feels, senses a real responsibility for Israel's fortunes, both in terms of security and economic and technological future. So there's a lot to do there, and I appreciate that answer. Let's go to Stuart Sloan. Stuart, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, it's actually two related questions. The first one is everybody says that the United States lost this war, but I'm thinking about Israel. Didn't Israel actually gain something by, they used to call it mowing the grass, deferring any real existential threat to Israel, but with the destruction, even partially, of the Iranian military, didn't Israel buy a few years in terms of what Iran could do to Israel? That's one question. The second one is about the regime change. I read somewhere that the initial plan was for the Kurds to attack, and that the United States or Trump vetoed it after getting advice from other countries and from his own friends. Was that really the key, or maybe the only key to getting regime change, is having the opposition with weapons, in this case, the Kurds?
Yeah, those are two great questions. And the first one's relatively easy to answer. And I think I agree with you. I don't think Israel and the US had identical goals in terms of, going back to that point about political strategy, military strategy. I think they had slightly different goals going into this. And I think it's a great indicator of what you were saying, that Israel hasn't been attacked since there is a degree of deterrence that has been established. Now, will that last? No, of course it won't, because the Iranian regime are, religiously motivated extremists, and they will continue to try and rearm and rebuild and re-attack Israel as part of their religious mission. But yeah, as you say, it's absolutely bought some time for Israel, and that can only be a good thing. When it comes to the ground offensive, I think you've got it exactly right. I mean, look, we'll never know what happened in that meeting between Netanyahu and Trump. The reporting is pretty blunt, and it's clearly slightly political in terms of who looks good and who looks bad coming out of it. But I think if we take that report that the Kurds were meant to be armed and have an incursion into the northwest of Iran, if we look at the noise that was happening around that time, I think it's credible that was the plan. I think it's also credible that Erdogan picked up the phone and called the White House and said, I will strike these Kurds if you do that. which of course would have put two NATO members in direct conflict, as they have been for a while in Syria, to be fair. So that was something I think Trump would have been very keen to avoid, and that plan got cancelled. And then, yes, we get to the key challenge here, and that is that the only people with guns in Iran is the Iranian regime, and they have nearly 1 million men armed. Now, how on earth do you overthrow that when the opposition don't have any guns? Even if you kill all of the head, all of the commanders, the whole IRGC, upper echelon, all of the mullahs, kill them all. Everyone in that chain is radicalized. Over 50% of IRGC training is radicalization. And there's a brilliant British Iranian guy called Kazra Arabi, Aarabi, who is an expert on IRGC recruitment and training. And he's published some fascinating stuff about their training pipeline. And over half of the time is spent radicalizing them. And they're already radicalized before they start. And they make them more radical during their IRGC training. So the idea that these guys are going to change sides or abandon their religious philosophy is just not going to happen. But they're the only ones with guns. So even if you create this vacuum, the only thing that can fill that vacuum credibly is the guys with guns. So you're just going to keep creating a vacuum to be filled up by more extremists. And so if you say you bomb them enough that they splinter into 1 million parts, now you've got 1 million extreme parts floating around in conflict, not only with each other, but also with the people themselves. And that's who's going to be caught up in this, unfortunately, is the people of Iran. And so, we've seen this so many times play out in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, to an extent in Syria. If you push this kind of regime change aspect, you have to know what's going to follow on the regime you've removed. And it has to be better than the regime that you've removed. And you have to have a credible pathway to get there. And we're not seeing any of that right now, which is why I'm skeptical about the regime change option. Even if you go back to that argument about, we're closing Hormuz, we're going to economically squeeze the regime till it internally collapses. Okay, then what? Then who takes over? It's because it's not going to be the unarmed people. It's going to be the guys with guns. And none of those are good guys. So, there's just no coherent planning for a regime change that I'm seeing right now. And yet, Stuart, to go back to your point, it absolutely needs to be. You need to have boots on the ground. And we're not seeing any right now.
Yeah. Thank you both for that. Good exchange. Andrew, can you say a few words about the new Labour government in the UK? What do you see moving forward? There are some well-known names there, some more concerned, some less concerned. How do you see the balance in the UK today?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've had a very British coup, a very polite coup, where Labour just said, no, we don't want you. We're going to get this guy elected and then you can walk away. Any questions? And Keir Starmer went, okay, I'm going to the pub. That's literally what he did yesterday. After leaving Downing Street, he went straight to the pub. There's photos of him drinking a pint.
He wants to be Secretary General of NATO, I think, too.
I think the chances of that are relatively low. Yeah. But look, Andy Burnham's an unknown quantity. He's not been a minister since the Blair era. He was a junior minister then. He's been a mayor of a city in the north of England. He's done a pretty socialist job. He's spent a lot of money without a huge amount of result. So it's not a great track record coming in. In terms of the big hitting appointments, he's appointed John Healey as Chancellor of the Exchequer, genuinely renowned as a good guy. Really well thought of on both sides, both Conservative and Labour respect him. He did a good job as Defence Secretary, so that's not a terrible appointment. Shabana Mahmood continues as the Home Secretary. She's been surprisingly good, actually. She prescribed Palestine Action as a terrorist group. She cracked down on use of things like Intifada on these marches. She recently helped semi-prescribe the IRGC in the UK. She's genuinely been far better than I think any of us thought that she would be. So again, that's not a terrible appointment. Very worrying is our new Foreign Secretary, who's a guy called Ed Miliband, who is, I don't know if you're familiar with Mr. Bean. That's basically our new Foreign Secretary. Very, very left-wing. The big concern is that they've appointed a guy of Jewish extraction. He's not a practicing kind of religious Jewish man, but he is of Holocaust survivor extraction. The concern is with the lingo and the history of the Labour Party with anti-Semitism that he could be kind of the cover guy for some really aggressive moves against Israel. That it's a fairly cynical appointment to give kind of Jewish cover to sanctions and various other legal kind of official moves against Israel. I expect to see a much harder line against Israel under this new government. So that's probably the most worrying appointment for me. The other two I think are fine domestically. I think we're going to see tax and spend, which is not going to be very pleasant for anyone, but that is what it is. Unfortunately, Labour do get in every now and again in the UK. We endure their tax and spend for a term, and then they're out of power again for a generation, and that's what I expect to see. But yeah, it's going to be tough, I think, in terms of British-Israeli relations for the next couple of years going forward. And so, ELNET UK are going to have a really tough job on their hands. They're going to need support from the mothership, shall we say?
No, absolutely. So before we end this, and we talked about so many positive, optimistic things, Andrew. What does give you hope in the Middle East? And maybe I could, lay out two trends for you to maybe talk about. One is the whole IMEC process, and of course, there's an effort to remove Israel from the future trade routes. But this is the most important global trade route between India and Europe. And Israel's right in the middle of it, and there'll be a lot to be said and done on that in the coming years in terms of infrastructure and ports and railways and relationships with Jordan, with Saudi Arabia, and other countries. So it's a bit of a derivative to the Abraham Accords question that you asked before by Tom. But how do you see that playing out? How significant is that? And the second trend line is, the fact that Israel was, and certainly is today, a leader on technology, a leader on missile defense that Europe needs, a leader on intelligence with a lot of practical, experience from this 3-year war. It's not just Ukraine that does it on its end, but Israel through missile defense and adaptability, and AI through the radar systems and the probabilities of where the missile will actually land. And there's so much that Israel has to contribute to European defenses at a time of extreme need in Europe. So what does give you hope moving forward, and what should we be thinking about building on for the future?
Yeah, I think things like IMEC are ideal, and I think the huge global energy instability that comes as a result of this ongoing Iran war, I think that is going to be a powerful driver for things like IMEC, or even alternative routes as people try to find a way to take. So if you can't change the geography, you change what you do with the geography. And I think we're going to see a lot of people looking for alternative oil export routes that don't go through Hormuz. So that presents opportunity for Israel, as well as things like IMEC, which is obviously the biggest beast in terms of the energy moves. But there's loads of smaller beasts that could do real good things. But when it comes to Israel, I think what gives me hope is the broader view here. And I think we all can get caught up in presentism and just look at how things are now. But actually, Israel's always been at war since 1948. There's never been a generation of Israelis that haven't had to effectively give up some of their children to the defense of their country. Every generation has losses and wars to fight. So this is nothing new for Israel. Likewise, Israel, certainly since at least the 60s, has had enemies that have tried to isolate it, that have tried to turn it into a pariah. Look at Jeffrey Herf's book, Undeclared Wars on Israel. You can pick and lift that playbook from that book about the 1970s all the way through to today, and there's no difference in tactic, and it's never worked because I think Israel does have those two things that you speak about. The first one is that incredible industry, that incredible offer to the world in terms of technology, in terms of forces for good. And I think as long as Israel remains a force for good, that is a very, very difficult thing to put down, because countries will always want to do business. Even if they don't do it publicly, they will do it privately. And then I think the other really interesting factor for Israel, I think, is the way it does outreach to the world. So not just in terms of what it sells or what it can offer, but actually in terms of the diaspora, in terms of the friends the diaspora makes, in terms of how Israel is almost bigger than just a very small country in the Middle East. The way it sits on that nexus of history of the world's three major faiths. I mean, it will always be a very special and unique place that doesn't really sit within its own borders. It's much, much bigger and broader than the geographic limits of the state of Israel. And I think that is really powerful, and that will continue to resonate going forward.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And I think that's an inspirational message to our group. We have an important cause. We're unique in this space, Andrew, and we look forward to continue working with you and engaging with you and benefiting from your experience and perspective on some critical geopolitical issues that we're all very focused on. So we want to thank you again for everything you do with us. You've been present at our UK dinners. You've been leading our delegations on the ground. What you said about delegations to Israel, I think we should all hold very close to our hearts, and continue this mission moving forward. And I believe that 2027 will be a critical year. It just will. No matter which way you cut it, it's going to be a time for critical relationships, and as you said, following up on alumni and decision makers. We're seeing it right now with Horizon Europe, how high those stakes are when you take these opportunities seriously and professionally and work with legislators and leaders in building these platforms for the future that we can all benefit from. So we wish you all the best. Keep up the great work. We're looking forward to your book. We'll certainly feature it in our network here, and keep following you. And thank you again for everything you do. You're a very important voice.
It's been a real pleasure, and it always is. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We'll see you very soon in our next Diplomacy Club briefing in the coming months. Thank you.